Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Do you feel it? Do you feel the palpable excitement? And I don't mean that our movie is premiering a week from Wednesday, which is palpable. But I mean Shavuos, Matan Torah, the gift of Torah. What a day in the history of the world. We'll be celebrating it. Begins tomorrow night, Tuesday night, and the holiday is Wednesday and Thursday outside of Israel. We celebrate when God's self appeared at Mount Sinai and gave the Torah into the world. The Jewish people, so to speak, as custodians of the Torah. But the Torah was given to the world. Most of the commandments in the Torah apply to the Jewish people, but 7 of them, the Noahide commandments, apply to all people forever. And the wisdom of the Torah is for all people forever. And thank God that tradition began on that day. And here we are continuing that tradition together. So in light of that, no class tomorrow night. And we'll have special schedule tomorrow, Tuesday. We'll do like Friday. So we'll do noon. Special time tomorrow, noon Pacific tomorrow, Tuesday. No class Wednesday, no class Thursday. I thought about doing it late Thursday night as we come out of the holiday, the way we do when we come out of Shabbos, but it's just not going to be realistic. So then we'll have Friday at noon, then Saturday night, etc. We're doing pretty well. We're only a few days behind. I know lots of Daf Yomi Shir that fall further behind than that. If we were all in the same city together, we could just keep learning together during the holiday. But thank God we have our virtual base midrash, and it's only possible to learn together when we can be online. And so we'll just fall a little bit behind. But the schedule this week, Tuesday class tomorrow at noon, Tuesday class at noon, no class Wednesday, Thursday, Friday at noon, Saturday after Shabbos, Sunday we're back on schedule. And I can tell you right now that on Wednesday, June 19th, the day of our big world premiere of Guns N' Moses, is the opening night gala of the LA Jewish Film Festival. Yeah, there won't be class that day either, but that's June 19th, further down the line. Okay. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in Missouri, Paul in the Great Northwest, Guy in Ohio, Shandor in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, John in Maine, Melissa in Great Neck, Jonathan in Thousand Oaks. That's not so far away. Come to the premiere, Jonathan. Belle, where are you? Where'd you go? Belle in West Virginia. Christo Cheney, leave the case behind. He's talking about the title, about leaving the mezuzahs behind. This, fascinating. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Lucy in Minnesota. Sharon, one of the presenters at her Tikkun Leil Shavuos tomorrow night. Her topic is argue to the sake of heaven. Or is that argue for the sake of heaven? Maybe it's you mean to the sake of heaven. Very interesting. But yes, it's a tradition that on the first night of Shavuos, so Tuesday night, tomorrow night, you stay up all night, learning all night. Do you know why we do that? The Midrash says that on the day, the greatest day in the history of the world, in the history of the universe, right? Because the whole universe was created for the sake of that day, when God gave the Torah into the world. On that day, the Jewish people overslept. Now, I think it was a setup, right? I mean, how could the entire people, depending on how you count, 2 or 3 million people, all oversleep? I think God wanted us very refreshed and ready, and he arranged like perfect sleeping conditions that night. Quiet, beautiful, maybe a perfect little breeze, the perfect amount of white noise. Everyone, no stress. And everyone slept beautifully that night. but they all overslept. And so to make up for that, for all of us oversleeping on the day of Matan Torah, the giving of Torah, the sages instituted that we stay up all night. It's a tradition. It's not a commandment, but it's a tradition, quite widespread, that people stay up all night learning Torah. And there's beautiful programs. I'd love to take Sharon's class. I've been so busy this year, I'm not teaching any program that night, but in our shul, I think we have a lineup of 6 or 7 teachers going to give beautiful classes that night. Wonderful tradition. Christo, still living in Lubbock, Texas, visiting Pittsburgh for a few weeks soon. Bill, I do have a question regarding that. Why is it that the Torah portion cycle renews on Simchas Torah rather than on Shavuos? What can I say? I'm a liturgy geek. They pay me for this stuff. It's such a good question. Such a good question. Why is it that in our annual cycle of reading the Torah, it begins and ends on Simchas Torah, which is a few weeks after Rosh Hashanah, and it could have been done on Shavuos, right? It could have, that the cycle repeated on Shavuos. Great question. I've known the answer in the past. I can't recall off the top of my head why it was chosen then. Joseph in Lowell, Massachusetts. Aoife in Florida. Spencer in Connecticut. Welcome, everybody. Let's do this. Our daf today is page 102 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're picking it up on 101b near the bottom with Mishna number 7 here in chapter 8. And then, God willing, we'll finish this Mishnah and open the next. Okay, Mishnah 7. If one rents out a house to another person, so the landlord bears the responsibility for providing the door, the bolt, the lock, and for providing every item in the house that is essential for normal living and which requires the work of a craftsman to provide it. That doesn't mean you have to provide all the furniture and the cooking utensils, but it has to be a properly equipped home, right? Not the furniture, but working door, working windows, working skylight if it has a skylight. Everything has to be working properly. If it requires the work of a craftsman to do it, then the landlord is responsible for that. But if the item does not require the work of a craftsman, then the renter is responsible to make it, right? Simple household repairs, that's going to be on the renter. The manure found in the courtyard of a rented house is the property of the landlord. We're going to go into greater detail on that. And the renter has rights only to the ashes that come out of the oven and the stove, which can also be used as fertilizer. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about manure and who has the rights to the manure. I think that is a gorgeous, spectacular teaching. If there's a holy and a righteous way to account for who has the rights to the manure on the ground, how much more, kal vachomer, should we be righteous and meticulous and careful to make sure that we, never misappropriate something that belongs to somebody else, and just being very careful to live an honest and righteous life in every area of our lives, even when we're talking about the manure in the courtyard. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The sages taught in a baraisa, if one rents out a house to another, the landlord bears the responsibility to install doors for it, to open windows in its walls, to provide light for it, to strengthen its ceiling, and to support its crossbeam that holds up the ceiling. And the renter bears the responsibility to make a ladder for it to provide access to the roof. That's so interesting. You would think the ladder that provides access to the roof would be the landlord's responsibility. But you know what? He doesn't have to have people up on the roof. And if the renter puts up that ladder so people can go up on the roof, then guess what? We know it's a mitzvah to have a parapet on a roof so people don't fall off it. So if the renter is providing access to that roof, the renter has the responsibility to erect a parapet for its roof. Also, it's the renter's responsibility to construct a gutter for the roof to carry away rain and to plaster the roof so that rain does not leak through it. Obviously, he's going to do that so it doesn't get on him and his stuff, but also so it doesn't damage the house owned by the landlord. The students in the study hall raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshes. Upon whom is the obligation to affix a mezuzah? Okay, so we all know what a mezuzah is, but just in case we don't all know what a mezuzah is, right? Now, most people, if they haven't done some learning, they think that the mezuzah is, either a plain or a nice or a very beautiful case, a little box that sits in the door frame of the home of a Jewish person on the front door. No. Right? So the mezuzah is the scroll, which has verses from the Torah, that is inside that case. The case is only a protection for that scroll. The mezuzah is the scroll. And it's not only on the front door, it's all the doors and archways of the home, unless they go to a closet or to a bathroom. But basically every other doorway and archway in the home should have a mezuzah scroll hanging there. And people like to put the scrolls in nice cases that will, both protect the scroll and have an attractive, element in the decor of the home. Okay. And it's a law. Most people are pretty familiar with this. If they have a mezuzah in their home, they know that you have a responsibility when you move into a new home, whether you bought it or you're renting it. If you are the resident of the home, you have 30 days to get a mezuzah onto that home. So here's the dilemma in the Gemara. Upon whom is the obligation to affix a mezuzah? So the Gemara expresses surprise at this question. Why did they ask about a mezuzah? Doesn't Rav Misharshia say affixing a mezuzah is the obligation of the resident, the one who lives there? It is certainly the responsibility of the renter if we're talking about somebody who's renting a home. And the Gemara amends the dilemma. Rather, the dilemma was upon whom is the responsibility to prepare the place where the mezuzah will be affixed. For example, to bore a slit in a stone doorpost to insert the mezuzah there. Right? If your home is made out of stone, and many homes in the Holy Land, especially in ancient times, were made out of stone, that's not so simple. They didn't have very nice electric drills that make a perfect little nice hole in stone. This is not so simple. So then upon whom is the responsibility to make the slot where the mezuzah scroll can go? So Rav Sheshes said to them, you learn this in the Mishna, with regard to an item that does not require the work of a craftsman, the renter is responsible to make it. And this task is also something that does not require the work of a craftsman. Really? If you're going to go carving a slit in a stone doorpost? No, it's not the work of a craftsman, because you don't have to make a slit in the stone doorpost, as it is possible to insert a mezuzah inside a hollow reed and then affix the whole arrangement to the doorpost, presumably not making holes and inserting the scroll in it, but somehow attaching this hollow reed. And when we talk about a hollow reed getting attached, now it's starting to resemble our protective cases that protect the scroll that's inside. Now we're actually on page 102a, and the sages taught in a Baraisa, if one rents out a house to another, the responsibility to prepare a mezuzah for it and affix it is upon the renter, and, now here's the surprise, and when he leaves, he may not take it in his hand and leave with it, rather, he must leave it there. So before I go any further, he must leave it there. Now, I just told you that the mezuzahs, you have to put them in every doorway in the house. Every doorway to a bedroom, every archway, like a study, if there's an archway to the living room, so a nice size house could easily have 15, 10, 15, 20 mezuzah scrolls in that house. They all have to be written by a sofer, right? So by a scribe. And, well written, well executed mezuzah scrolls easily can cost $30, $40 each, and much more if you, go the distance and really beautify the mitzvah. Some people have very large scrolls. Some people in the Chabad community have like major league mezuzahs that are like this tall. And that, believe me, is a lot more than $40. So you're telling me that you're like renting a house, you put mezuzahs everywhere, and when you leave, you have to leave the mezuzahs behind? I mean, that's serious money. Serious money. Now, the Mishna, the Gemara continues, but if he rented a house from a Gentile, well, then he may take the mezuzah in his hand and leave with it. And there was an incident in which a renter took his mezuzah in his hand and left with it. And as a punishment, he eventually buried his wife and 2 sons. Now, the mezuzah is understood to provide protection for the inhabitants of the home. This is a commandment on Jews. Gentiles are not commanded to have a mezuzah on their home, so it doesn't provide this protection. But Jews are commanded, and so it protects them. So this guy who took it with him and didn't leave it there, it's as if he didn't care about protecting those other people, and he ended up suffering in his own family. Now, don't panic. I initially panicked when I read this because, we've been living in this house, thank God, for a long time. But previously, we lived in another house that was rented, and I don't recall leaving all our mezuzahs behind. Did I violate this commandment that is, from the sages here in the Gemara? So there's definitely nuances to it. So first of all, if the house is owned by a Gentile, and and you don't know that a Jew is going to live in it after you, for sure you can take the mezuzahs with you. Even according to some opinions, if it's owned by a Jew, but you don't know who's going to live in it after you, and it might be a Gentile, it's permitted to take them away. But there's a lot of nuance to this. So if you find that you're moving, talk to your local Orthodox rabbi about your situation. And you notice that here, they're not talking about plural. They're talking about the mezuzah. So I didn't have enough time to do some more research. Like, is the basic commandment on the front door? Although when we say the Shema every day, right, it says to inscribe these words on the doorposts of your house, that is plural, and on your gates. And so that's why we usually say the front door is like the gates, and the doorpost is all the doorposts inside. They are mentioning here in the Gemara, talking about in the singular. So like I said, there's more to research here. I don't have all these halachas. I'm not a rabbi. I'm certainly not a poskening rabbi. I don't know. If the situation is coming up for you, you should do more research. But the point is, it's not so simple that you live there, you are renting it, you're leaving, you take your mezuzahs with you. Requires a little bit more research and understanding and talking to a rabbi. But it would seem that in modern times, when people are, just typically moving in, moving out, no guarantee, often we don't even know our landlords, no guarantee at all that another Jew is going to live there. There is a difference, I think, in some of these laws between religious Jews and non-religious Jews. There's a lot more to it. Okay, so all I'm alerting you to is that there are issues here that require further investigation if you're moving out of a house and thinking about and we're talking about renting. So very interesting also. I suppose if you sell the house, that would seem to be different. But whether you're renting, whether you're buying, and whether you're selling, whether you had a Jewish landlord, whether you didn't, whether you know who's going to be moving in or you don't, these are all factors that need to be taken into consideration. Okay, the Gemara asks, was that incident cited to contradict the ruling immediately preceding it, which permits one to take the mezuzah? Rav Sheshes said the incident relates to the first clause. That's where they leave it. Now, the Mishna teaches, we're back to who owns the manure in the courtyard. So that's all we're going to say about the mezuzahs. Like I said, that's your situation. Do the research. And most especially, talk to your local Orthodox rabbi. The Mishna teaches, the manure found in the courtyard of a rented house is the property of the landlord. And the renter has rights only to the ashes that come out of the oven and the stove, which can also be used as fertilizer. So the Gemara asks, with what are we dealing? If we say that the Mishna is referring to a courtyard that is rented out to the renter, or where the manure was produced by the oxen of the renter, then why should that manure be the property of the landlord? It is clearly the property of the renter. Rather, the Mishnah must be referring to a courtyard that is not rented out to the renter, and the manure was produced by the oxen of the landlord. And the Gemara then asks, well, if so, the ruling is obvious, and it need not have been taught. Obviously, then the manure belongs to the landlord. So the Gemara says, no, that ruling was necessary in a case where the manure is in a courtyard of the landlord, and the source of the manure was oxen that came from the world at large and stood in the courtyard and produced the manure. And the Mishnah rules that in such a case, the manure belongs to the landlord. So the Gemara suggests that ruling in the Mishnah that any manure deposited in the landlord's courtyard belongs to him supports the ruling of Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina. As Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, a person's courtyard effects acquisition for him of an item placed in it, even without his knowledge, right? So very interesting. We're talking about your courtyard, right? So quite typical, ancient Talmudic times housing, sort of like a few 1 or 2 story houses surrounding a courtyard, and people have access to the courtyard. But who owns the courtyard? Sometimes it's jointly owned. Well, sometimes it's owned by the landlord, and he's rented out these homes that open out onto the courtyard. So if it's his courtyard, and something gets deposited there in a way that he could acquire it either with his hand, or if he's not there, his courtyard can acquire it for him. And we talked a little bit about this, how when a man is divorcing a woman, if she has a courtyard that is her courtyard and he deposits the get there, and it is a secure courtyard so that he and she are, know that if the get was deposited there, she will receive it, then she can be divorced by that action. So same idea, right? The landlord's courtyard can acquire what is deposited there. And if what is deposited there is manure from animals that wander into the courtyard and poop there, now you might think, who wants manure? Aren't we really talking about whose responsibility is it to clean up the courtyard and get rid of the manure? Oh, well, remember, agricultural society, and, in times of famine, where there's moisture in that manure and it is fertilizer, and it would allow you in very hard scrabble earth to maybe, grow some vegetables that could save your life. So that manure could indeed be a precious commodity. So let's not be so modern and dismiss it. Let's keep reading. So the Mishnah teaches, the manure found in the courtyard of a rented house is the property of the landlord, and the renter has rights only to the ashes that come out of the stove. And we already said, well, it's obvious that if the animal and the courtyard belong to the renter, the manure is his. If the landlord owns the courtyard and the animals, then the landlord owns the manure. If the landlord owns the courtyard and, passing by animals deposit their manure there, then that manure belongs to the landlord. The Gemara suggests, and so now we're tying that teaching to the teaching of Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, that a person's courtyard effects acquisition for him of an item placed in it, even without his knowledge. So the Gemara raises an objection to this ruling from a Baraisa. If one says, any lost items that come into my courtyard today, my courtyard should effect acquisition of them for me. He has not said anything of legal significance, and he does not acquire those items. So the Gemara explains the objection. And if it is so, that this ruling that Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says is correct, i.e. that a person's courtyard does effect acquisition for him of an item placed in it, even without his knowledge, so then why has this person said nothing of legal significance? And the Gemara explains, with what are we dealing here? In the Baraisa, we are dealing with a courtyard that is not secured. as the law is that such a courtyard does not affect acquisition of items for its owner. That's not like placing something in somebody's hand, because if it's insecure, something goes in, something comes out, people pick it up, people take it, it's not secure. But the Gemara questions this. If so, say and try to explain accordingly the latter clause of this baraisa that states if knowledge of the existence of that lost item spread through the town, his statement stands and his courtyard does acquire it, even if it's an unsecure courtyard. The Gemara explains the difficulty. And if the baraisa is referring to a courtyard that is not secured, even where knowledge of the existence of that lost item spread through the town, what of it? Such a courtyard is unable to effect acquisition for its owner of items placed in it. But the Gemara answers, once knowledge of the existence of that lost item spreads through the town, people withdraw themselves from it, as they assume that the owner of the courtyard will take it. Therefore, no one will even try to take it, and the courtyard will be like a secure courtyard, which can effect acquisition of items for its owner. So the Gemara objects to Rabbi Yossei's ruling, citing another baraisa. Refuse of the oven and of the stove, which here we're talking about ashes, and that which is collected in the renter's vessel from the airspace of the courtyard is the renter's property. And refuse that is in the cowshed and in the courtyard, meaning manure, this is the property of the landlord. So the Gemara now explains its question. And if it is so that this ruling that Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, Yossi or Yose? Yose, but here it's Yossi. I think that's a misprint. I think we're talking about Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says is correct, i.e. that a person's courtyard effects acquisition for him of an item placed in it, even without his knowledge. Then, with regard to refuse collected from the airspace of the courtyard, why is it the renter's property? It was first in the airspace of the landlord's courtyard and should consequently be acquired by him immediately. Now, these questions of airspace, we haven't had them too much lately. We saw a lot of questions about airspace in Tractate Shabbos and Tractate Eruvin, where, we ask when something passes through the airspace of somebody's property, right, over the property, can we ever say that that item came to rest, legally speaking, in the courtyard or in that property, or do we not say that, right? So Abaye said the baraisa is referring to a case where the renter attached his vessel to a cow's rear end. So any manure produced by the cow would immediately enter the renter's vessel, right? He's got a little poop catcher behind the cow. So even though the poop emerged from the cow and was in the air over the landlord's courtyard, because the renter didn't rent the courtyard, the courtyard still belongs to the landlord. But presumably the landlord allowed the animals of the renter to stand in the courtyard. And the renter wanted to keep the manure for himself because now we have the mixed case, renter's animal, landlord's courtyard. So if the poop hits the courtyard, hits the ground, then it would belong to the landlord. But if it gets caught in this poop catcher in the rear end of the cow, then the renter keeps the manure, right? Which is important fertilizer. Like I said, it could be life-saving. So any manure produced by the cow would immediately enter the renter's vessel. It would not even enter the airspace of the courtyard, and the renter would consequently acquire it. Rava said an item in the airspace of a courtyard that will not eventually come to rest in the courtyard itself is not regarded as though it had come to rest. So accordingly, even if the refuse traveled through the airspace of the courtyard, meaning the poop catcher was lowered down by the cow's ankles, where am I? Even if the refuse traveled through the airspace of the courtyard, since it was always on course to enter the renter's vessel, it is not acquired by means of the landlord's courtyard, so it remains the renter's property. So the Gemara asks, and is this principle really so obvious to Rava? But didn't he raise it as a dilemma elsewhere? As Rava said, as a dilemma. If one cast a purse through this doorway of a house and it went through the house and exited through that doorway, what is the law? Right? So imagine a barn with barn doors, big barn doors, right? And so you could throw a purse of money through the barn, right? It starts in a public domain. It flies through this privately owned barn, in one door, out the other, and lands, let's say, in the public domain beyond the barn. So can the barn owner say, well, that purse is mine. It landed in my property. It never landed in your property. It flew through your property. He said, well, the airspace of my barn acquires that purse of money for me. Can he say that? So Rava said it's not clear, right? He raised it as a dilemma. What is the law? Is an item in the airspace of a courtyard that will not eventually come to rest in the courtyard itself regarded as though it had come to rest, or is it not regarded as though it had come to rest? And the Gemara explains that Rava's dilemma concerned a different case. There, in the case of the purse, nothing at all interposes between the purse and the floor of the house, and therefore Rava was unsure about the house, about the law, the halacha. But here, where the renter's vessel, meaning his poop catcher, interposes, right, between the poop that's falling and the courtyard belonging to the landlord, here it was obvious to Rava that the renter's vessel does affect acquisition of the item. And the Gemara analyzes the latter clause of the above-cited Baraisa. And refuse that is in the cowshed and in the courtyard is the property of the landlord. And the Gemara asks, can these two statements coincide? By stating that the refuse in the cowshed, belongs to the landlord, it indicates that the refuse in the courtyard does not belong to the landlord, that it would belong to the renter. So how then can the Baraisa continue to rule that even the refuse in the courtyard belongs to the landlord? So Abaye said that this is what that Baraisa is saying. And refuse that is in the cowshed, that is located in the courtyard, rented out to the renter, is the property of the landlord. If they didn't specify, does the cowshed come with the house? That's the point. If they didn't specify that the cowshed comes with the house, then the cowshed does not come with the house. And that's why the manure in the cowshed continues to belong to the landlord. So extrapolating from Abaye's statement, Rav Ashi said, and that is to say that one who rents out his courtyard without specification of what is included in the rental agreement has not rented out a cowshed that is located in it. And the Gemara raised an objection to Rabbi Yosei's ruling from a different Baraisa. There is a mitzvah to dispatch a mother bird if one wishes to take eggs from her nest. Deuteronomy 22:6 and 7. This is understood to be the easiest mitzvah to fulfill if it comes your way. You can't go looking for this mitzvah. But if you happen upon a nest and a mother sitting on eggs, right, and you're going to take the eggs because you're going to use them, then before you take the eggs, you shoo away the mother bird so that she doesn't see you taking the eggs. Which would be considered an act of cruelty. You can't go seeking this mitzvah, but if it finds you before you take the eggs, you shoo away the mother bird. Why is that relevant here? The mitzvah applies only if the bird and the eggs are ownerless. Doves of a dovecote and doves of an attic are subject to the obligation of dispatching the mother bird as they are ownerless. You're like, doves in a dovecote? Wouldn't you think that if somebody has a dovecote, right, like a series of places where doves roost on his property, that he owns the doves? And so since the shooing away the mother bird before taking the eggs is only for ownerless birds, how are these birds ownerless? Answer, quite interesting, is that at least in ancient times, it wasn't like somebody's raising carrier pigeons. It's more like he's got a situation like an attic in a house where wild doves come and make their homes. but he didn't put them there, right? And that's why they're considered ownerless, because even though the nest is on his property, he doesn't own the birds. The birds come and go when they want. And so therefore the mitzvah would apply. So nevertheless, they are subject to the prohibition of robbery. So wait a minute. If he doesn't own the birds, how can they be robbed from him so that it's prohibited for others to come and take them? Answer, because the birds made their nests on his property, right? And so the sages instituted, why? To maintain the ways of peace, darchei shalom, right? So to promote the ways of peace, the sages said the mitzvah of shooing away the mother bird applies because the birds are ownerless. Nevertheless, you can't go and catch those birds on somebody else's property because we don't want you trespassing and we want to promote the ways of peace. Now, the Gemara gets to the question. And if it is so that this ruling that Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says is correct, i.e., that a person's courtyard effects acquisition for him of an item placed in it even without his knowledge, well, then a dovecote or an attic in which these birds roost will affect acquisition for its owner of any eggs that are deposited there, right? And if the eggs are his, well, then the mitzvah of shooing away the mother bird wouldn't apply. And if the eggs are not his, then this would seemingly contradict the teaching of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, that your courtyard acquires items deposited there for you even without your knowledge. Right? Accordingly, one should apply here the principle that the mitzvah to dispatch the mother bird from upon her nest applies only if it happened before you, which excludes, let me go back, even without his knowledge. Well, then a dovecote or attic will affect acquisition for its owner of any eggs inside them. That's what I said, right? That's the contradiction. So accordingly, one should apply here the principle that the mitzvah to dispatch the mother bird from upon her nest applies only, quote, if it happened before you. That's how it's worded, Deuteronomy 22:6. And this excludes a bird or egg that is readily accessible. So that's the difference here. Readily accessible, such as one that one owns, from the mitzvah to dispatch the mother. And yet, so that's why we say that the eggs have to be ownerless in order for the mitzvah to shoo away the mother bird applies. And now here's the contradiction. And yet our Baraisa rules that the mitzvah does apply in this case, right, where the eggs would seemingly be owned because they were deposited within the property of the property owner. So Rava said it is from the time of the emergence. So they have a problem. They have a contradiction. How could this mitzvah apply, which we said only applies when the eggs are ownerless, if the wild birds make their nest on somebody's private property? And Rabbi Yosef says that his property, his courtyard, acquires that which is deposited there even without his knowledge. And so then if the eggs are his, why does the mitzvah to shoo away the mother bird apply? So since they have this contradiction and they need both things to work, that Rabbi Yosef's ruling works, because Rabbi Yosef is almost always right, and that the mitzvah to shoo away the mother bird does apply for these wild birds that nest on somebody's property, so they need to reconcile this contradiction. And now they're going to get in tight, right? Now we're going to narrowly define what we're talking about in order to make the contradiction work. So Rava said, it is from the time of the emergence of the majority of an egg from a mother's body that one becomes subject to the obligation of dispatching her from her eggs. And the owner of a courtyard does not acquire the egg until it fully emerges and falls into his courtyard. And therefore, when the Baraisa teaches that in the case of doves, of a dovecote, or of an attic, one is subject to the obligation of dispatching the mother bird, it is referring to a time before the egg falls into his courtyard. Seemingly, I mean, it's so strange, right? Before it, like once it falls, I mean, I don't know what the status of the nest is, but once it hits, the ground or any like protrusions of his wall in his attic where the bird made its nest, then his property acquires the egg for him. So what they're really splitting hairs and saying, Okay, well, if you find a nest where you're going to have the mitzvah to shoo away the mother bird, but it's on private property, well, that mitzvah is only going to apply while the egg is coming out of the mother and before, it lands. Very strange. Because then, how are you going to shoo away the mother? I mean, it would seem like the egg has to be laid into your hand. But then don't you acquire it when it lands in your hand? So I'm confused, but let's keep reading. So Rava said, it is from the time of the emergence of the majority of an egg from a mother's body that one becomes subject to this obligation of dispatching her from upon her eggs, and the owner of a courtyard does not acquire the egg until it fully emerges and falls into his courtyard. And therefore, when the Baraisa teaches that in the case of doves of a dovecote or of an attic, one is subject to the obligation of dispatching the mother bird, it is referring to a time before the egg falls into his courtyard. So the Gemara says, if that is so, that the Baraisa is referring to a case where the egg has not fully emerged. So why does the Baraisa rule that they are forbidden by rabbinic law for others to take due to the prohibition of robbery? And the Gemara answers, that ruling of the Baraisa is referring to the mother. You can't rob the mother because she is sitting in the property of another person. And if you wish, say instead, actually that ruling is referring to the eggs. And the reason that the sages enacted that taking them is robbery is because once the majority of an egg emerges, the dovecote or attic's owner's mind is upon the eggs to acquire them, although technically he will not acquire them until they fully emerge. And now that Rav Yehuda says that Rav says it is prohibited to acquire the eggs as long as the mother bird is upon them, as it is first stated, send away the mother, and only then is it stated, and take the young for yourself. So even if you say that the eggs fully emerged and fell into his courtyard, he will not acquire them. Because in any case in which a courtyard owner is able to acquire an item by himself, his courtyard can effect acquisition of it for him. But in any case in which he is unable to acquire an item by himself, his courtyard cannot effect acquisition of it for him either. And so the Gemara asks, well, if that is so, that the Baraisa is referring to a case where the courtyard cannot effect acquisition of the eggs for him, why does the Baraisa rule that they are subject to the prohibition of robbery due to the rabbinic ordinance to maintain the ways of peace? If one dispatched the mother bird, in which case the courtyard would automatically effect acquisition of the eggs, then taking them would be full-fledged robbery. And if one did not dispatch the mother bird, doesn't he need to dispatch her before it is permitted to take the eggs? Either way, one will have transgressed Torah law. Why then does the Baraisa refer to a rabbinic prohibition of robbery rather than it's prohibited by Torah law? And the Gemara answers, the Baraisa is referring to a minor who is not subject to the mitzvah of dispatching the mother bird. And the Gemara challenges this answer based on the latter clause of a Baraisa. Is a minor subject to the rabbinic prohibition of robbery enacted to maintain the ways of peace? And the Gemara explains, this is what the latter clause of the Baraisa is saying. The father of a minor who took such eggs is obligated to return them to the owner of the dovecote or attic due to the rabbinic prohibition of robbery instituted to maintain the ways of peace. This discussion of shooing away the mother bird in order to take the young or the eggs is not by any means exhaustive. We haven't learned the law. It's much more complex. And it was really only cited here in passing to challenge the idea that the landlord's courtyard acquires the manure of passing animals so the landlord owns that manure rather than the renter who's living in the house adjacent to the courtyard, absent them making arrangements specifically about the courtyard. So if you ever come upon a nest, like out in a park, and you want to do this mitzvah, there it's possible because it's clearly ownerless and you shoo away the mother and take the young. But what do you want the young for, right? You don't take it if you're going to just then dispose of the young. The laws are much more complicated and requires a lot of research. And if you find a nest on your property, then it's a lot more complicated whether it's possible to fulfill this mitzvah or not. So if you're ever contemplating performing this mitzvah, for sure check with your local Orthodox rabbi first, because most of us will never do this in our lifetime. It would be nice if we'd be able to fulfill this mitzvah that's so rare. But before you do it, it requires very careful study and preparation and counsel from a poskening rabbi. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7 here in chapter 8. Now, Mishnah number 8. In the case of one who rents out a house to another for a year, and then the year was intercalated, adding an additional month to that year, right? Remember that it's the Jewish month is a lunar month. So when there's 12 lunar months, we're short like about 10 days compared to a solar year. Some months are a little bit longer, but in 7 out of every 19 years, a whole extra month gets added to the Hebrew calendar. Which month? We've talked about this a bunch of times. Adar, right? So Adar, the month that has Purim in it, the month of joy. We add a second Adar, right? And so that's what it means that a year gets intercalated, means an extra month gets added. So that year has 13 months instead of 12. Why is that going to be relevant here, landlord-tenant law? Because what happens if you rent out by the year? What happens if you rent out by the month? Right, and now there's an extra month. This is not an issue that comes up in secular law, but definitely comes up in Jewish law, in Torah law. So, in the case, and here's the thing to remember: right now the calendar has been set and was set, almost 2,000 years ago. We know exactly which years are going to have leap months in them and which aren't. But in ancient times, that was not the case. The Sanhedrin would decree when was the first day of a month based on the sighting of the new moon, and they would decree when a year was going to have an extra month of Adar added into it. So it was not entirely predictable, and so the question really became important if a landlord and tenant had an arrangement where there was going to be rent paid by the year or rent paid by the month. What happens if an extra month gets added into the year? So, Mishnah 8, in the case of one who rents out a house to another for a year and then the year was intercalated, adding the leap month, then the fact that it was intercalated is to the benefit of the renter, since the rental was defined in terms of a year, right? He rents by the year. So the additional month is automatically included and the renter need not pay any additional rent for it. But if a landlord rented out a house to another for a year, but with the price set as a certain sum per month, and then the year was intercalated, then the fact that it was intercalated is to the benefit of the landlord, right? If the arrangement is that you pay a certain amount per month and an extra month gets added, so you have to pay an extra month. If you pay by the year, then you don't have to pay anything extra. An incident occurred in Sipori involving one who rented a bathhouse from another, where they stated at the time of making the rental agreement that the rent would be 12 gold dinars per year, comma, one gold dinar per month. And then the year was intercalated. So it seems like they said both things. This is the yearly rate and this is the monthly rate. And it makes sense because 12 dinars per year, right, and 1 dinar per month. Works perfectly well in any 12-month year. Now, they probably said this because they knew, the landlord certainly knew, that there would be some years that have 13 months in them. That's why he said it. Now we're on page 102b. Fear not, 102b is much shorter than 102a. And this incident came before Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and before Rabbi Yosei, and they said the two expressions have contradictory implications, and it is uncertain which expression should be followed, and therefore the landlord and the renter should divide the extra month, the intercalary month, between them, i.e. the renter should pay half a gold dinar for that extra month. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, was an incident cited to contradict the Mishnah's initial ruling? And the Gemara explains the latter clause is incomplete, and this is what it is teaching. But if the landlord said to the renter that the rent would be 12 gold dinars per year, 1 gold dinar per month, and then the year was intercalated, so the intercalary month should be divided between them. And in addition, an incident like this actually occurred in Tzipori involving one who rented a bathhouse from another, and they stated that the rent would be 12 gold dinars per year, 1 gold dinar per month, and then the year was intercalated. And this incident came before Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and before Rabbi Yosei, and they said the landlord and the renter should divide the intercalary month between them. So Rav said, if I had been there as a judge, I would have given the entire month to the landlord and ruled that the renter must pay for it. And Rav understood that the statement defining the rent should be understood based on the principle of the final expression used is the defining expression, the dispositive expression. Since it was 12 gold dinars per year, 1 gold dinar per month, and 1 gold dinar per month was the final statement, that's the final agreement according to Rav. And that's why it would be a monthly agreement, and the renter would have to pay an extra month. And the Gemara asks, what is Rav teaching us? Could he be teaching that when a statement consists of two expressions with contradictory implications, one should attend only to the last statement? Sounds like, yes. But didn't Rav already say that principle once before? As Rav Huna said with regard to a case in which a seller fixed the price of an item using two different expressions that indicate different amounts, and the buyer agreed and took the item, that they say in the study hall of Rav that if the seller said an astera, 100 coins, i.e., which is copper perusos, so then the buyer must pay him 100 coins. And this is despite the fact that an astera is not worth 100 coins, where the coins are perusos. An astera is worth 96 perusos. So if he said an astera, which is worth 96, 100 coins, then the 100 coins is dispositive, according to Rav. And if the seller said 100 coins, comma, an astera, well, then the buyer must pay him an astera, even though the astera is worth less, 96 coins, not 100. So it is already apparent from this ruling that Rav holds that one should rule according to the final expression. So why did he restate his opinion with regard to the case of the intercalary month? And the Gemara explains, if Rav's opinion were known from there, I would say that the second expression is explaining the first. And that is the reason to follow it. But one would still not know the law in a case in which the second expression undeniably contradicts the first. Therefore, Rav teaches us that in all cases, one acts in accordance with the final expression. And Shmuel said in explanation of the ruling of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yosei, in the Mishna, we are dealing with a case where the landlord came before the court in the middle of the month. Only in that case is the disputed month divided between them. But if he came at the beginning of the month, the entire month's rent would be awarded to the landlord. And if he came at the end of the month, the entire month's rent would be awarded to the renter. And the reason is that it is uncertain whether or not one always acts in accordance with the final expression, and consequently, whether the renter must pay for the extra month. So with regard to upcoming days of rental, since the landlord has possession of the property, he can demand rent. And with regard to days that have already passed, where the question is whether the renter must pay for them, since he is in possession of his money, he cannot be made to pay. Shmuel does not hold that only the second statement is followed. And the Gemara asks, did Shmuel actually say that we do not say that one should attend only to the last statement? But don't Rav and Shmuel both say, if a seller says to a buyer, I am selling you a core of grain for 30 sela, then he can renege on the sale, even while transferring to him the last sa of grain, as a core is equal to 30 sa, or sa is the way it's usually said in yeshivish anyway. It is apparent that each sa is being sold for 1 sela. But since that breakdown was not made explicit, the sale of the entire core is considered as a single entity. Until the entire core has been transferred, the sale does not take effect. So if the seller used two expressions, I am selling you a core of grain for 30 sela, a sa per sela, Then the buyer acquires each of the 30 sa of grain only one by one, immediately upon each being transferred to him. And the seller cannot renege on the sale of any sa that it has already taken place. Although the implications of the seller's two expressions are contradictory, Shmuel rules that one should act in accordance with the final expression. Seems to agree with Rav. And I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara explains there, in the case of the grain, Shmuel's ruling was not due to the fact that we attend to the final expression, since it is uncertain whether or not we do so. Rather, what is the reason for his ruling? It is due to the fact that the buyer has already taken hold of the grain and consequently has presumptive ownership of it, right? Remember that generally speaking, right, any monetary cases that come before a rabbinic court, the one who is seeking to extract money or property from the one in whose possession that money or property is, the one seeking to extract has the burden of proof. All the more so if, we're dealing with a case of doubt, then you really have to overcome the doubt, because in most cases of doubt, we're going to leave the money or the property where it is, since the law is doubtful whether we have the basis on which to extract the property from where it currently sits. Right? So it is due to, so here too, in the case of the bathhouse, each party is holding on to the basis of his claim, i.e. the landlord has possession of his property and the renter has possession of his money. And it is only due to this reason that Shmuel rules as he does. And Rav Nachman said, I would have ruled that since the law is that land is always in its owner's possession, even when rented out, the landlord is entitled to the entire month's rent. And the Gemara asked, what is Rav Nachman teaching us? Could his ruling be based on saying that one should attend only to the last statement? But then this is identical to the ruling of Rav. So the Gemara clarifies Rav Nachman's ruling is unlike Rav's, as Rav Nachman would award the extra month to the landlord even where the order of the two expressions is reversed. Rather, as he explained, his ruling is based on the fact that the landlord has possession of the property, and therefore to extract from him something that is his, we don't do, and that's why the rent is owed to him. We're going to conclude there. Reminder, tomorrow's class, special pre-holiday time, noon Pacific, no class Wednesday, no class Thursday, and then we'll be back for the regular Friday time of noon Pacific. Okay, a few questions. Sharon, if you have very expensive or sentimentally valuable mezuzah cases, can you get less valuable cases but leave behind the scrolls? Absolutely, right? I would say that in a case where you have to leave behind the scrolls, why are we doing that? For the protection of the person, who's going to come in next, where you have reason to know that a Jew, who is presumably a Jew who is mindful of mitzvahs enough, that he would need that protection of any Jew needs the protection of mezuzah, but there's also some nuance to this about Jews who respect the mitzvahs or not. But if the point is to leave behind the scrolls for the protection of the one who's going to move in after you, it's the scrolls that protect, not the cases. So absolutely, you can take the case with you, and I think what you could probably do is just arrange a very inexpensive but protective case, because we don't want something to happen to the scrolls. But as long as they're protected, even just saran wrap in a plastic bag would probably take care of the matter. But again, I would say talk to the rabbi. Bell, my maternal grandmother was brought up on a farm in Poland, and when she rode with us during planting season in our rural community and she smelled the fertilizer, she would say, "There is a wealthy farmer." Note that by the time I was a child, anhydrous ammonia had replaced manure as a fertilizer. But the smell is the same. Very interesting. I definitely, I walk through my neighborhood a lot when I go to Shul on Shabbos, and, at certain times during the year, people fertilize their lawns. It's funny, when I grew up, in the suburbs in New York, I don't remember we ever put down manure as fertilizer. It was bags of more chemically type of fertilizer. But here in this neighborhood, it's definitely manure. I don't think it's something that has the same smell as manure. It's manure. The bags say manure. And it really smells strongly. And yeah, it's like, I agree with your grandmother. Like, there's something healthy about that. It doesn't smell like disgusting, poo of like, animals that aren't, and humans whose poo is not used for fertilizer. And maybe it's been cleaned, and I don't know how they prepare it. But yeah, I guess, and maybe it's just these animals that only eat grass, their poo smells a lot better. And hay, right? And that's why it's like, it's good for the grass, and it's, I agree with your grandmother. It's a smell of, that's going to be a nice lawn. Joseph, this principle of not looking for an opportunity to fulfill the nest and bird mitzvah, does this apply to other mitzvahs, to not look for it, but only if it comes to it? I believe not. That is one of the few mitzvahs that has this requirement, that it has to happen to you. You have to happen upon it. That is very rare. I'm not even sure if there are other mitzvahs like that. Well, I guess there is, in the sense of finding a lost object, right? I mean, you can go, like beach combing and stuff. You're looking for lost objects that way. But in terms of, coming across somebody's clearly lost property, and then, now you have the mitzvah to safeguard it, to announce it, and to do your best to return it to its owner. That's something that happens to you. But generally speaking, of course, we're seeking out mitzvahs, right? We want to set times for Torah study. We want to, go in and stay with our Torah study. We want to set times for praying. We want to say brachas. We're looking for mitzvahs to do. But the bird nest is one that has to happen to you, and there's only a few others that are like that, and I don't know offhand which. Ilani, just one more day to go. Keep the count. Yes, thank God. I've counted the sephiras, the days of the Omer every day, and I was able to say it with a bracha, and continue saying it with the bracha. If you miss a day, then you can count again, but you can't say the bracha anymore. And so, yes, exactly. Last night we counted 48. Last night, we counted 48, right? And there are 49 days of counting. Today was Psalm 48 for Monday and day 48 of the Omer. I am guessing that does not happen very often. Right, very good. Nice, good observation, Eleni. That's right. Right, so the Monday Psalm, there's a Psalm of the day every day. I didn't even realize that it was 48 on Monday and it fell on 48th day of the Omer. Beautiful. Thank you for letting us know that. Lucy, it may not count as a mitzvah if the proper conditions are not present, but is it not more compassionate anyway to shoo the mother away if one needs to take the eggs? Definitely. One could consult the rabbi afterward. Right, exactly. Like if you're talking about, your hens that lay eggs in your chicken coop, right? So it's not the same mitzvah. You're not fulfilling the mitzvah. Like I think when you fulfill this mitzvah, you probably say a bracha, right? But when you just, take away the eggs from your hens, you don't have to say this blessing, but absolutely it would be the compassionate thing to do, to shoo away the mother before you take the eggs. Yes, yes, yes. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, tomorrow, special time, noon Pacific, pre-holiday time. All the best. Have a great night.